Hey guys, thank you for joining us virtually these past couple weeks. I miss you guys. We miss being together. We miss looking around the room and watching you guys act crazy. I even miss getting you in trouble sometimes. And I never thought that I would say this, but I actually even miss being on the West Side. The first thing I want to do is remind you that we have you on Instagram. Like, your leaders follow you on social media, so we see how you don't know how to act on Snapchat and then also don't text us back 5 minutes later. So that is a friendly reminder to text your leaders back. On a serious note, I did see a lot of you post last week in regards to the Ahmaud Arbery shooting and killing. I saw you post things that said, "What's the point? They aren't going to stop killing us. What can I even do about this? It's pointless." You expressed how sick and tired of it you were, how angry, how sad, and how scary it is to live in a society like the one we do. And I want you to know that your anger is valid and it's justified, and we are in it with you. You have heard us talk about the character and person of Jesus all year. And today I want to do that again in light and consideration of all these hard conversations that we've had to have lately. And I want to start by reading Mark chapter 5:21. Jesus again crossed to the other side of the Sea of Galilee in a boat. A large crowd gathered around him by the seashore. A synagogue leader named Jairus also arrived. When he saw Jesus, he quickly bowed down in front of him. He begged Jesus, "My little daughter is dying. Come, lay your hands on her so that she may get well and live." Jesus went with the man. A huge crowd followed Jesus and pressed him on every side. Okay, so here you have Jesus arriving at the scene and there with his disciples, and there is a crowd around him. So in society, is Jesus a person who is in a place of privilege, or is he oppressed? The answer to that is actually both. We know that Jesus experienced depression for a lot of other different reasons, but in society, his parents didn't have a lot of money. He came from a low-income household. He was a Jew under Roman occupation, which means that the Romans were dominant and Jesus's people were not. But we also know that he had privilege because he was a male in a society where males held standing over females. He was a rabbi. He was a teacher, which means he had some level of influence. He was free in a society of slaves. And while he was a Jew, he also wasn't a Samaritan. And Samaritans were the lowest of the low. And so that is Jesus's social standing here. And then you have Jairus, who comes onto the scene, and Jairus is a leader in a synagogue. So he probably had money. He had influence. He was well known. And so Jairus is also someone who is in a position of privilege here. And so Jairus comes to Jesus and he says, "My daughter is sick and she's dying and I need you to heal her." And because Jesus loves Jairus, he says yes. And so here these two go with the crowd following behind him. In the crowd was a woman who had been suffering from chronic bleeding for 12 years. Although she had been under the care of many doctors and had spent all her money, she had not been helped at all. She had become worse. Since she had heard about Jesus, she came from behind in the crowd and touched his clothes. She said, "If I can just touch his clothes, I'll get well." Her bleeding stopped immediately. She felt cured from her illness. At the moment, Jesus felt power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "How can you ask who touched me when you see the crowd pressing you on all sides?" But he kept looking around to see the woman who had done this. The woman trembled with fear. She knew what had happened to her. So she quickly bowed in front of him and told him the whole truth. Jesus told her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be cured from your illness." So on their way from the crowd, a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years reaches out and touches Jesus, and it says that she is immediately healed. And Jesus felt power come out of him, and he turns around and he said, "Who touched me?" And everybody thought that was crazy. Even the disciples were like, "What do you mean, who touched you? There's literally so many people here." And so I want you to notice what Jesus did. Jesus, in this scenario, he has a place of power. Literal power. People are gathering around to touch him so they can be healed. They're following him. He has influence. He is in a position of privilege. And then next to him is Jairus, who also has a position of power and privilege. And so when Jesus asks, "Who touched me?" he shifts the attention from them to her. And when that happens, when she comes forward, she gets to tell her whole truth. She told her whole entire story in front of people who had outcasted her, who had looked down on her. She got to tell her sorrows and all the injustices she faced over things that she had no control over. And Jesus is listening, and he's listening, and he's listening. I'm sure she had a lot to say. It had been 12 years of suffering. And you have to remember, Jairus is still there. And this is crazy because in this society, Jairus's needs would have never have been put on hold for her. In this society, his needs would have never been made equal to hers, and they were in the presence of Jesus. So not only did he heal her physical body when she touched him, but when he looked over at her and called her daughter and gave himself to her, he healed her identity. And when he heard his whole story, when he heard her whole story, he gave her her heart back. And if you keep reading, Jairus' daughter experienced a miracle that is unique to Jairus' story and is crazy and wonderful all on its own, because there's enough Jesus for all of us. But what I want you to get from this is that Jesus is listening, and he's listening, and he's listening, and he hears your whole story and all the sorrows and all the injustices you have to face over things that you have no control over. He hears the story, the one where you're raised in a culture that values your brothers over you, the one where you are stuck in quarantine with an abusive family and there's no escape anymore, the one where you're anxious and depressed and no one's noticed, the one where you were bullied and you are lonely and afraid and abandoned and heartbroken, the one where you gave everything you had to someone who just decided that they didn't want to love you back anymore. He hears your whole truth, your whole story, and he wants to give you your heart back. And lastly, what I want to say is that on behalf of Young Life Charlotte Urban Team, we are angry and we are grieved over the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. I think I said this to you, a lot of you, when Ahaji passed away. I wish so badly I could protect you from everything that is so unfair and unjust, but I can't. I can only push you towards Jesus. And I want you to know that he heard Ahmaud Arbery's whole entire story, his whole truth, all the injustices he faced all the way until death. We love you. We miss you. And we will always, always fight for you, because you matter. Your stories matter and your lives matter.